The global corporate landscape is undergoing a profound, unforgiving transition. Executive leadership can no longer rely on short-term operational resilience. The mandate is now sustained, technology-centric productivity. We are observing a severe macroeconomic paradox in this space. Currently, 88% of organizations are experimenting with advanced algorithmic systems, yet a staggering 81% have failed to realize any meaningful bottom-line returns. Consider the scale of capital involved here. The global technology spend is forecasted to reach $6.15 trillion by 2026, with AI-related spending alone hitting $2.53 trillion. Yet the vast variance in value capture across the market indicates that the simple deployment of digital tools is completely insufficient. Real economic impact requires a structural rewiring of organizational workflows, highly disciplined capital allocation, and a proactive response to the evolving realities of the enterprise technology stack. We are moving decisively past the era of experimental novelties and entering a period of strict structural realignment.
To navigate this structural realignment, we will follow a strict, calculated roadmap for this explainer. We begin with a high-stakes executive overview. We then conduct a detailed operational postmortem on deployment failures. From there, we examine the human blueprint. Finally, we establish the chronological action plan and the guardrails required for safe execution.
Section 1. High-stakes hook and executive overview. We are witnessing a pronounced wealth concentration in the enterprise technology sector, and understanding it requires looking closely at this massive 81% failure rate for initial deployments. 74% of the total economic value generated by these new systems is currently being captured by a mere 20% of organizations. That top-tier cohort separates itself by pointing these capabilities toward business model reinvention and market expansion, rather than settling for basic transactional cost reduction. The 81% failure rate is the direct, unavoidable result of the bolt-on approach. Deploying a new digital capability into legacy workflows only yields isolated, localized improvements. It creates a veneer of modernization while preserving the underlying operational decay. Without structural rewiring across the enterprise, broad user adoption and enterprise-wide impact remain virtually impossible.
There is a measurable, unforgiving financial tipping point at play here. The data shows that organizations investing below a critical threshold of 1.6% of corporate revenue see negligible baseline returns. They're funding their own stagnation. However, those in the high quartile bracket who allocate above that 1.6% threshold experience a massive operational surge. We are tracking a 9.5% EBITDA outperformance and a 20.2% higher total shareholder return compared to their peers. Revenue performance jumps by 3.5%, and operational cost reductions push between 14 and 29% depending on the specific sector. Underfunding transformation guarantees failure by starving the initiative of the resources required for systemic change. But funding alone, without the mandatory workflow reinvention, is equally destructive to the balance sheet.
Beyond internal operational inefficiencies, enterprises are operating under severe, compounding geopolitical strain. From shifting policies in Saudi Arabia and Japan to regulatory tightening in the United States and Europe, global fragmentation makes organizational rigidity a massive vulnerability. Almost half of leaders in large organizations cite the structural rigidity as a primary challenge to survival. This macroeconomic environment demands a posture of composable resilience. Enterprise architecture must deliberately pivot away from single-vendor dependencies and rigid, heavily localized supply chains. You must anchor operations on zero-trust frameworks, building systems that can modularly adapt to regional shifts without collapsing the global network.
To traverse this kind of foundational disruption, total executive commitment is required. There is no middle ground. Consider the transition model engineered by Mark Garrett at Adobe when the company shifted entirely to a subscription revenue model. They adopted what was essentially a burning the boats strategy. Garrett and the executive team understood that maintaining parallel operating models indefinitely guarantees failure, simply because it splits organizational loyalty, fractures technical resources, and provides a safety net for those resisting change. Adobe made the difficult, deeply unpopular choice to remove the old option entirely. They deliberately modeled a valley of lower initial revenue, they managed board expectations through that localized decline, and they forced the entire enterprise to commit to the new architecture. There was no turning back. This level of cold, calculated conviction is precisely what is required to cross the digital transformation threshold today.
Section 2. Detailed operational postmortem. We must identify exactly what is broken in the deployment pipeline.
The overarching mandate for this phase is process before platform.
The legacy code base is currently the single largest barrier to scaling advanced capabilities in the modern enterprise. You simply cannot embed an autonomous agent into a 15-year-old software monolith and expect predictable production behavior. This is the harsh reality of technical debt. When leadership attempts to automate inefficient, siloed, or poorly documented processes, they do not solve the inefficiency. They simply scale and accelerate that precise inefficiency across the entire organization at machine speed. True technical re-engineering must replace or fundamentally restructure the underlying architecture so that advanced capabilities are woven natively into the core workflows, rather than bolted precariously onto the edge of a decaying system.
When we deconstruct the specific barriers holding enterprises back, regulatory and ethical concerns certainly dominate the discourse across North America and Europe. But the true, underlying bottleneck is the data foundation itself. The analytics indicate that 0% of organizations currently possess the data readiness required to scale advanced use cases globally. That is not a rounding error. It is a systemic failure. Critical business meaning remains trapped in fragmented legacy code and disconnected departmental dashboards. Without shared semantic models and explicit machine-readable business logic, automation efforts remain entirely stuck in localized pilot mode, completely incapable of scaling to the enterprise level.
Ignoring these technical foundations creates severe compounding operational risk. Consider the reality of machine-generated code. The data shows it contains nearly 3 times more security vulnerabilities than human-written code. Specifically, we are tracking a 2.74 times increase in vulnerabilities. Furthermore, 45% of these generated codebases fail standard OWASP security tests straight out of the prompt, introducing massive privilege escalation risks into your production environment. Engineers can no longer just operate as pure developers. They must evolve to operate as system architects and rigorous security auditors. Deploying generative technology without strict auditable governance is a fast track to enterprise data breaches.
A clinical look at the average capital breakdown reveals the exact root cause of these systemic implementation failures. Currently, 62% of deployment capital goes to direct technology spending. 34% is directed toward process redesign. A mere 4% is allocated to workforce training. This dramatic, almost negligent underfunding of the human element is a critical enterprise vulnerability. Your technology stack is only as effective as your workforce's cognitive ability to operate it. Neglecting workforce transformation, reskilling, and the fundamental redesign of job architectures ensures that the massive 62% spent on software licenses and cloud compute will completely fail to deliver its intended return on investment. Section 3. The Human Blueprint. The workforce is either your primary barrier to scale or your central accelerator.
There are severe human dynamics at play that executive leadership frequently miscalculates. Many leaders fall into what is called the enablement illusion. This is the mistaken belief that simply providing a new digital tool automatically equals an increase in productivity. In reality, poorly managed deployments induce massive change fatigue, where employees become exhausted by a constant cycle of superficial software rollouts. Even more disruptively, we are tracking the seniorization of entry-level roles. As automated systems successfully absorb the routine, low-level tasks, junior employees are abruptly deprived of their historical apprenticeship phase. They are forced to make complex, system-wide decisions on day one entirely without the necessary experience runway that previous generations relied upon.
This dynamic creates what we define as the 3-tools ceiling, which is inducing massive cognitive exhaustion across the enterprise. When employees are forced to manually context switch between disconnected digital platforms, cognitive fatigue spikes drastically. The data shows this brain fry rate reaching 25% in marketing departments and hovering near 20% across human resources and operations. Instead of modern technologies streamlining the daily workflow, the heavy psychological burden of integrating these fractured systems is being pushed directly onto the individual employee. This destroys deep focus and severely degrades daily output. The downstream operational effect of this cognitive fatigue is highly measurable, and it is severe. Organizations report a 39% spike in operational error rates directly caused by this multi-tool exhaustion. When you force your human workforce to serve as the integration layer between poorly architected, disconnected software monoliths, you guarantee a degradation in output quality. That 39% spike represents a massive increase in critical operational failures, compliance breaches, and degraded customer experiences.
To see exactly how this friction plays out in production, we analyzed the recent Klarna case study. Klarna initially executed a massive, highly publicized push toward autonomous automation. They deployed algorithmic systems to replace hundreds of customer service agents, projecting massive immediate cost savings on the balance sheet. However, they soon executed a very hard pivot back to highly skilled human agents. The reasoning behind this reversal is clear. While automated systems succeed brilliantly in handling high-volume, simple, explicit queries, they completely collapse when forced to navigate sensitive, emotionally charged, and highly complex operational disputes. The friction of an automated system repeatedly failing to resolve a complex fraud dispute actively destroys customer trust. It permanently severs the lifetime value of that client.
This Klarna pivot perfectly underscores the concept of identity capital and the absolute necessity of sustained human oversight in enterprise architecture. Identity capital refers to the accumulation of tacit knowledge, ethical reasoning, situational nuance, and deep contextual judgment that human employees naturally build through years of practical experience. Algorithms cannot replace these human traits. While machines excel at processing massive volumes of explicit, structured data at scale, human operators remain strictly required for tasks demanding empathy, intuition, and complex problem-solving in highly ambiguous situations. Protecting, cultivating, and leveraging this identity capital is not a human resources initiative. It is a strict strategic imperative for executive leadership.
Section 4. Chronological Action Plan and Guardrails. This is the definitive operational roadmap for safe enterprise scaling.
The foundational step in this sequence, Phase A stability, is completely non-negotiable. You must secure the absolute integrity of your core enterprise data before authorizing any attempts at systemic optimization. This requires executing secure, highly governed migrations into unified datasets. It means aggressively scrubbing your financial ledgers for accuracy. It means establishing deeply auditable infrastructure and completely validating physical and digital inventory. If your foundation is fractured, layering advanced automation capabilities on top of it will only accelerate the production of non-compliant errors. Stability must strictly precede scale.
Once that baseline stability is achieved, leaders must apply strict operational frameworks for task delegation. The Anandawu playbook categorizes work strictly by the cost of potential errors and the absolute requirement of explicit versus tacit knowledge. Low-risk tasks requiring explicit, highly structured data fall safely into the no-regrets zone for rapid automation. Conversely, high-risk tasks requiring deep human intuition remain strictly locked in the human-first zone. In the intermediate areas, machines act as creative catalysts to augment workflow, or they require strict human-in-the-loop quality control to prevent systemic drift.
Contrasting these two extreme zones demonstrates exactly where autonomous agents provide actual enterprise value and where they must be strictly relegated to a supporting role. In the no-regrets zone, characterized by rapid automation, low risk, and explicit data, you do not need perfect accuracy. The economic value lies in completing routine, high-volume tasks faster and cheaper at machine scale. Conversely, in the human-first zone, involving high operational stakes and tacit knowledge, mistakes carry severe financial, legal, or reputational consequences. Here, technology may assist in gathering or structuring data, but the ultimate decision-making, the ethical oversight, and the final executive accountability must remain firmly with experienced human leaders.
Leaders must actively demystify these specific technologies to build authentic organizational trust across the workforce. Data compliance, strict auditability, and hallucination monitoring are not optional bolt-on features that you address in Phase 2. They are foundational architectural requirements from day one. In heavily regulated enterprise environments, a system that cannot clearly explain its outputs or generate an immutable audit trail is simply not production-ready, regardless of how accurate or impressive it appears in an isolated sandbox testing environment. Strict governance and ethical compliance guidelines are mandatory prerequisites for enterprise-wide adoption. We conclude this analysis with a calculated challenge directly to senior leadership. Is your enterprise architecture built natively for the operational demands of the coming decade? Or are you merely retrofitting 15-year-old monoliths in a desperate attempt to keep pace with the market? The data clearly shows that those who aggressively fund structural workflow transformation, prioritize the protection of their human capital, and mandate strict foundational governance are pulling away. They are capturing the vast majority of the economic value. The ultimate accountability for deploying production-ready, highly governed, and structurally sound technical ecosystems rests entirely on your shoulders. The experimental phase of enterprise technology is over. It is time to execute.